Hey guys, this is Ray, owner of Double R Diesel. Welcome back to my shop and the channel. And today's big news worthy of a video is that President Donald Trump has actually given a full pardon to someone who violated the Clean Air Act, specifically with regards to diesel emissions. So you've heard me talk about a shop owner by the name of Troy Lake before in some prior videos, and I had mentioned that he was seeking help through a Senator, Cynthia Loomis, to get a full pardon from Donald Trump. Well, over the weekend, he actually got that. Donald Trump sat down and started doing some pardons for some people I think that he had on his list. And Donald Trump granted a full pardon to Troy Lake. He's a Wyoming diesel mechanic convicted of violating the Clean Air Act for tampering with diesel emission systems. Specifically, Troy's case involved removing and disabling onboard emission systems on heavy-duty trucks. And Troy became like the poster boy, you would say, for the diesel community because he was getting some attentions. Most enthusiasts view his example as excessive overreach by the federal government. And I agree with that because they busted up in his shop and held him and his employees at gunpoint. And anyway, through a process of how the government works, they sentenced him to, I believe it was a year in jail and fined him $50-some thousand. And he ended up, I think, serving about 6-7 months actually in a federal penitentiary. And they released him on house arrest, and that's where he has been. So he's still been under arrest. He's still been incarcerated, you might say. And he is was a convicted felon. And when you're a convicted felon, you cannot vote. You cannot possess firearms. It's just, it's not good for you. So anyway, Donald Trump did take the case into consideration, and he issued Mr. Lake a full pardon. Now let's talk about the pardon. So the pardon basically negates his criminal liability. Now, I do not know, I might be wrong, but I do not believe it negates any civil liability that he had in this case. So the money that he was fined, he probably will not get that back, but he is no longer a convicted felon, and he now has the right to vote again and possess firearms and everything that any us, regular citizens can do. So how does this relate to the industry as a whole? Well, by pardoning Lake's criminal liability, that still does not change federal law. The Clean Air Act and its prohibition against emission tampering still is in full effect. The EPA still has authority to prosecute similar cases until Congress actually changes the law. So basically what Trump did here was more of a personal decision, and it has no effect on current law. So with court cases that are ruled upon, that can give legal precedence to future things in the future, but this has no legal precedence whatsoever. So it's basically, looking at this thing strictly from, how the laws interpret and how you're supposed to do things. This is just a personal decision that Donald Trump decided to do to pardon Mr. Lake. So it would be no different than somebody convicted of murder being pardoned by a governor or even the president. It still doesn't change the fact that murder is illegal. So same here with this case. What could change things for us in the future? So let's talk about the Diesel Truck Liberation Act. Once again, Senate Bill 3007. This was introduced by Senator Cynthia Loomis, a Republican from Wyoming, back in October. And the Diesel Truck Liberation Act seeks to overhaul federal emissions law as it applies to diesel vehicles. As of right now, the bill remains still in committee and has not passed either chamber of Congress. So It's still sitting in committee. It's basically you're sitting where a lot of bills end up dying. But, there's still some hope for us that possibly this could be, a game changer for us in the future. I'm hopeful for that, but we have to examine the facts. So the Diesel Truck Liberation Act, let me talk about that briefly. Basically, it ends federal requirements for emissions control devices and onboard diagnostics on any vehicle or engine. It basically prohibits the EPA or any federal agency from enforcing emissions control on diagnostic systems. It grants immunity from civil and criminal liability for modifying or deleting emission systems. Basically voids all existing federal regulations under the Clean Air Act for relating to emission control devices. And it basically retroactively vacates and expunges past penalties for emissions tampering. So, the Diesel Truck Liberation Act would be what all of us who are diesel enthusiasts love to see passed. It basically would allow diesels to be deleted legally, and for us people who were either convicted civilly or criminally, it would basically null and void those cases, and our records would be put clean. So you wouldn't need a pardon. So anybody that was convicted criminally, they would no longer be a criminal, and somebody like me who was convicted civilly may not get my money back, but my name would not be no longer on a record with the Environmental Protection Agency, which, by the way, you can go look on the EPA's website and find the settlement for my case, and it's always going to be there unless something like this is passed. So let's talk about legal and political implications concerning the Diesel Truck Liberation Act. So the Diesel Truck Liberation Act would effectively end federal emissions control for all diesel engines. However, if that were to happen, states could still enforce their own emissions law, particularly California and other states operating under the Clean Air Act 209 waiver, which basically is the backbone for CARB. So all these CARB states, if something like the Diesel Truck Liberation Act was passed, they could still enact their own state laws prohibiting emissions removal, emissions tampering, and if you live in those states, then you're still subject to penalties and prosecution if you were to disable emission systems. Likewise for shops like us, we couldn't sell into those states if that was the case. So, the Diesel Truck Liberation Act basically, once again, is everything that we in the diesel community would want. But, if it were to happen, there would still be provisions in which states could make it their own law to go against it. And there will probably also, what I wanted to mention here is there would be probably some political lawsuits against such an act. So it really would have to overcome a lot of hurdles in order for guys to be able to delete their trucks legally, and it would also have to overcome a lot of hurdles for shops like mine to be able to legally sell delete packages. So how does this all tie in, or could it all tie in to the Troy Lake part? And so let's stop and think about this, and this is the part that I'm really kind of hopeful about, is that Cynthia Lummis, the senator from Wyoming, she helped push the pardon of Troy Lake. She's also the one that has introduced this bill, the Diesel Truck Liberation Act, Senate Bill 3007. So she has gotten attention of Donald Trump by getting a pardon petition to him and getting that pardon granted. So when you tie all this together, her bill might get a second look while in committee in the Senate. So it might get looked at and it might get considered, since it's got the attention of the president and he basically felt that it was warranted to pardon Mr. Lake. Like I said, that was a personal decision by Donald Trump. It does not have any legal precedence, but it could signal a change. Okay. So was doing some digging here, and what would be the likelihood of the Diesel Liberation Truck Act passing as it's currently written? So let me back up just a second. So as it's currently written, it is very broad, and it basically will nullify the EPA's authority to regulate emission standards on anything with an internal combustion engine. And it would also have implications all the way back to factory, and then all the way back down to the consumer level. So if the Diesel Truck Liberation Act were to pass, then manufacturers would be off the hook for having to put emissions control devices on diesel engines, or even gasoline engines for that matter, possibly because of how it's so broadly written from the factory. And of course, we would have legal grounds to delete the current systems on vehicles. So it's what I'm trying to say. It's so broad and it covers so much that actually that could be a detriment in it actually getting some traction and, you know, passing the Senate and actually making it to the president's desk. So experts give it in its current form in about a 25% chance of passing because it is so broad. Now, if they were to narrow it down so that it only applies to diesels only in certain situations like farm use, off-road use, diesel trucks over a certain age limit past their useful life limit on the emission systems, then it might have a much better chance of passing. But that's the thing, it's the way it's written right now, it's so broad that it makes it have a lower chance of passing. Now, could that happen? Well, what could happen? So it sits in committee, it's never picked up, and it just dies and goes away. Or it sits in committee and it gets picked up and they decide to pick the language apart and basically amend the written bill so it's a little more specific. That could happen, and then it could go to a vote in the Senate and, you know, possibly pass that way. But still, though, whatever, you know, gets passed in the Senate would also have to pass the House before we get to the president's desk. So the likelihood of the Diesel Truck Liberation Act passing the way it's written right now is very low. But if they were to go in and make it a little more specific, it stands a higher chance of passage. But the good news is, overall, and the whole point of this video is Donald Trump has officially pardoned someone guilty of selling deletes and violating the Clean Air Act on diesel trucks specifically. So it could signal a change, at least at the very top, and maybe it'll trickle its way down to Congress. Right now, Congress is in its own way. They can't seem to get well, I'll take that back. I was about to say they couldn't even pass a budget, but I think they're about to do that, to do a continuing resolution on the budget bill. But basically, they're just still kicking the can down the road. They still haven't fixed anything, and for anything like this to pass, Congress has got to get off their butts and do something. But again, it's the whole point of this video. There is some hope based upon what Donald Trump did for Mr. Troy late this weekend. Now, I'll end this video by saying this. Although it does not set legal precedents, you got other people who have been convicted of the same thing criminally who may say, okay, if Mr. Lake got pardoned, why, maybe I can get pardoned. And they might start making some noise and reach out to the president for a full pardon. And if this thing starts snowballing, then it would bring more attention to the whole situation, which is a good thing. So it's going to be interesting to see how this all turns out. But as always, guys, I appreciate you following along. I thought I'd just bring this to your attention if you hadn't heard it already. And we're still hoping and praying things will change in the future. So as always, guys, if we can do anything for you, diesel-wise, let us know. Once again, I've got a gasoline tuning business, DRP Motorsports. If you got a Ford vehicle and you want that tuned, that's wide open. Hit me up, let me know. Check out my other website, drpmotorsports.com, and of course, rdiesel.com. Once again, thank you for following along. God bless you guys, and we will see you again very soon.